Well, anyway, I can start. I think my talk is going to be slightly different in two ways. First, that I think because it's a vast field, like there are so many things that can be said. I will be just going like try to generate an overview of topics, so there will be. It might look a bit more superficial compared to other talks, in which we really got into the maths, into the details. But feel free, like you can really, if you are interested in one specific thing, oh, but you didn't mention how do you measure how this thing is measured or analyzed, we can talk afterwards. So the idea is to try to give this overview. And then there are many things in which I'm really not an expert on the things that I'm going to talk. And there's people here that I know that you are much more used to these things. So the idea is that at some point we can stop, and I will maybe directly ask you for you to explain some of the topics. And then for the game, I don't know who's staying because there's no activity today. Where we can talk later.
Yeah, that's the thing, that I need to know who is doing the canyoning to make the group.
Okay, we'll do that.
Yeah, by the end of the morning we can.
Okay, we'll do that. But the idea is pretty open. It depends on the energy you have, how motivated you are, and I can help with that. But the idea is that if each person in the room would be the node of a network, which is what we'll talk about today, you can think of many different ways, many different rules that determine who's connected with who. For example, who has published a paper with who. That would be the typical one that's very easy to find, or whatever, like who has studied the same kind of species during his career. So try to create one network depending on the rules that you choose, and try to study different metrics of the things that we're going to talk today about this network. All of this depending on the energy you have in the afternoon. We can talk about it. Now, the starting point of the issue, of course, was already envisioned by Darwin, which is the last part of the sequence, of the sentence, which is the fact that all these species, all these plants and animals remote in scale, they are bound together by this web of complex interactions. And what we're gonna go for today, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about the web, and probably Jeff is gonna talk about the complex relations, so that's the difficult parts for him. So we've seen a little bit how mathematical models can help in understanding pairwise interactions. It can help a lot in predict why do we see the patterns that we see, and also Apnoe told us what happens when we have many layers of these kind of interactions. We can predict whether processes are going to be dominated by bottom-up dynamics or top-down kind of cascades, and many other things. But of course, the question is what happens when we deal with systems that have many species and also have many interaction types. It's hard to define trophic levels. It's not so obvious that things flow into one way or another. And this is the object of study of today. And yeah, to start, who knows which movie is this? That's 5 points. Well, there's no points. That's 5 points for who knows the movie. Was that? Good Will Hunting, yeah. And then 5 more points. Why am I putting this here? Okay, so the point is that the guy is like this, he's a janitor, he's cleaning the university at night. But he's this like crazy, amazing, smart mathematician. So he's solving this very difficult, I think it's Harvard. Well, this is MIT, that's at MIT. These very difficult problems that are on the hallway. And this specific one, I hope that by the end of the lecture, or by the middle of the lecture, the first part we should solve it. This is a graph. And this is what the studying, the tool that we're going to talk about today is, that is graphs. Now the graphs, we could say that they were somehow born 300 years ago, almost, when Euler was trying to solve the famous Königsberg bridges problem. I don't know if you're familiar, but there are many versions of this problem, and the idea is can we go through all these 4 parts of the city, that is the 2 mainlands, the 2 islands, can we visit these parts of the city in a walk that crosses each bridge only once? And it could seem that, okay, we can just try it by hand or with an algorithm. He didn't have computers, but he could be trying to say, oh, it seems hard, it doesn't seem hard. But he didn't have the proper tools to prove whether this is possible or not. And what he thought of is like, okay, let's try to not simplify. Let's try to make the system as abstract as possible. That is the minimum information. We have 4 nodes, which are 4 parts in a city, and each node is connected by bridges. That's the black lines. And what he understood, I don't know, is anyone familiar with the problem, how it works? Yeah, there's a computer scientist. This is the idea that people who's more. So, do you know how he understood that it's not possible to do this work?
Yes, basically the idea is that if the number of edges outgoing nodes is odd, then like at some point you have to go back through the node, and there will be one edge that is
Exactly. So you take, okay, I want to start here and end here. So the 2 other nodes that are the ones I just want to pass through, they need to have an even number of edges, because I want to go there and leave, go there and leave. Whereas he realized that each part of the city had 3 edges. So there were parts in which if you go there and want to leave, you will not be able to go through it in this way. And yeah, funny enough, today this is Kaliningrad in Russia. Today there are 2 bridges that are no longer there, so now we can do the walk. If we start in one island and end up in the other, the 2 mainlands only have, so you can come and leave, and then come and leave. So just this was like somehow an historical introduction, but so that was, it was much later. It's not graph theory is not that old, but it was much later that this became what is now known as graph theory, which is this branch of mathematics that studies these structures that are used to model interactions between objects. And it's a massive area of maths. I'm not really familiar with most of it, but some parts are very useful to us, as you will see. And it can study many of the properties of these pairwise interactions. And later on, when by the 1990s, I would say we started having a lot of data of real connections between pairwise entities. This is like an early map of the internet in 2005, and I don't think it's a complete one, but this is a network of interactions between genes, how genes regulate one another. So the fact is that there has been this big revolution of complex networks that came when we started using, not me, of course, they started using the tools of graph theory to understand how these very large databases worked, how what patterns were there in there, were there properties that we could understand, was each network different, and they realized actually there are many properties that are universal to many different types of networks. Which brings us to today, which is, can all this theory, all these methods of complex networks, of graph theory, can they help us understand what's going on here? What kind of processes, what can explain the patterns that we see in these networks? What kind of underlying processes can there be? Well, how do these things really look? Because if we look at it from here, it's very hard to understand what's going on. So, questions so far? That was like a super fast go. Henry?
Can you go to the metrics page that you have? That one. I guess one thing I've always been confused by with graph theory stuff is it always seems like these metrics are just like descriptive snapshots of the network itself. Is that true, or are these like, can you like predict aspects of the network?
Yeah, that's going to be most of the talk today, and the answer is depends.
Okay.
It's a you will see that. But that's one of the questions of today. What we're gonna try to see, depending on time, is first, what can we measure? If we have a network, what metrics can we extract out of it? That's first part one, what you know, just like this list of properties. Second is, what do we see in ecology? What has been seen? What has people measured? Just observations. And then, of course, it comes to kind of your question, which is, why do we see that? And this is one of the questions that will remain open more or less today, but at least in some parts. But these things that we're seeing, these patterns, are they a byproduct? As like sponge, something that just came out of the rules, or they are there because they are allowing the ecosystem, the community, to generate some function? This is what we're going to put, and depending on the time, we'll go through some other open questions. Now, for metrics, what can we measure? Provided we have a network, what can we get out of it? Now, first, the idea that graphs are encoded in matrices. That's the way that we used to have them and work with them. The idea that a graph can be undirected, meaning there's a connection between 1 and 2, but it doesn't have a direction. It can be directed, meaning 2 affects 1, but not the other way around. 1 doesn't affect 2. It can be weighted, meaning that different interactions happen at different strength. If it's strength or weight, it can be many things depending on what you're studying. It can be signed as well. Ecological networks are directed, are signed and weighted, meaning one species can affect another, but not necessarily another way around. The effect can be positive, can be negative, and of course can happen at different interactions. The strength that one species affects another doesn't necessarily have to be the opposite way. And all this is encoded in this adjacency matrix, which the element ij encodes the effect of j towards I. So it's kind of a little bit, it reads the other way around, but for example here, this is the element A12 that informs how species 2 or how node 2 is affecting node 1. Because this graph is undirected, it's equivalent to how species 1 is affected by 2. Okay, so far?
Just maybe to point the obvious, an undirected graph is a particular case of a directed graph. So the class in the middle is more general than the one on the left.
Okay.
Because you can simulate an undirected graph with a directed graph, but you can't do the other way around.
Okay. Yeah, mostly because you can indirected graph is a directed graph that's always pairwise.
Yeah,
so
with matrix is symmetric. And,
exactly.
Yeah, well, okay.
Yeah, perfect. You go on, it's good to have this. So things that we can look in a network. First, of course, we can look at the number of nodes and the number of edges. Super property number 1. Provided that we have S is the number of species, L is the number of links. We're going to talk about species and links, and nodes and edges. I'm going to for sure mix them. First question, what is the maximum number of links, provided that the graph is directed, so that things can go to one species, what effects can go from this species to that other one, and the other way around. What is the maximum number of links between that we can see, provided that we have S species? S squared, exactly. So the matrix, you have a whole matrix that's S squared. You have S squared elements. If the network is completely connected, everyone interacts with itself and with everyone else, you will have S squared values. But each time you have a 0, it means one of the interactions is not present, so you have less and less links. And ways to measure, to get like a first metric out of this, you can measure the complexity, the average links per species, but much more often you will measure the connectance, which is of the total number of links that Vasco said S squared, how many do we actually see? And of course, connectance is equivalent to the probability that a link exists. And you will see more of this during today. More important, okay, so this is a super average out, because we can see, okay, we see this amount of links, but how are they distributed? Does everyone has the same amount of links, or do some nodes have more links than others? And this is where we get a little bit more into detail, and we have the species degree, that is the number of nodes that in this case, because we will talk about directed, the number of the in degree refers to the number of edges that arrive, and the out degree, the number of edges that leave from that specific node. And this corresponds to the rows and columns. And for example, the in degree of species 4 is the sum of all possible elements, like the effect of 1 into 4, the effect of 2 into 4, 3 into 4, and so the sum of this row, while the sum of the column is the out degree, is the all species that are affected by 4. And degrees is one of the most, even if it seems basic, is one of the most relevant properties, because as you will see, it's really informative. Not the degree of one species, but how the degrees are distributed throughout the network. Is that, for example, in random networks, these things that we will be doing today, in random networks, all species more or less have the same degree, which is in this drawing would be 2. Everyone more or less connects with 2 other nodes. Whereas, for example, in scale-free networks that we're also going to talk about, most of the people most of the nodes are very hardly connected. They are not really connected. Whereas there are some very few nodes that have a very high degree. That is, they are really connected to the rest of the network. And of course, as you can imagine, this informs about more fundamental properties of the network. And for example, this small world network has been studied. There's a distribution of degrees. There's a distribution of degrees that ensures that this network, this type of networks, which are very common as well in social networks, you will see, are very connected. That is, not very connected, but the paths from one node to another are very short, even if the network is very big. And this, in social context, of course, there's the small world phenomenon, which, for example, I'm a good friend of Donna Lee, who's a journalist in the UK, and she got to interview Muhammad Ali several times. So that's 2 jumps. One from me to Donna, and one from Donna to Muhammad Ali. And something similar happened with George W. Bush. But the point here, the point is that this is not because I'm very connected. It's a property that's general to the whole network, to the way in which degrees connections are distributed in this network.
So I would like to point out that as of today, everybody is now 3 steps away from Muhammad Ali.
Yes. And 4 steps from George W. Bush.
Who are those guys? I mean, Bush, I kind of know who he is.
Yeah, this is Manuel Castellet, who's a mathematician in Barcelona. He was the PhD supervisor of my dad, like a good friend of the family. And he was head of some institution, like the research institution in Catalonia, so he got to interact with José María Aznar, who was the president of Spain back in the times of the Iraqi invasion. So, yeah, we're connected, but not friends, not positive interactions.
So, quick clarification then. When we're building these networks, is it a requirement that the links are all the same type? Like here, is it the link here an interview, or is it we just know them, or is it we're friends?
That's a very, very, very good question. So, in this case, and this is discussed in this paper, which is called the Small World Effect, I think. It's very nice. It's a review paper. It's very nice to read. In this case, we're talking about social contacts, and they usually say first name kind of contacts. So people who it's not that you know, but you have talked to him. So it's of course a bit weak. How do you define? But you can have, that's one of the problems that we're going to see with ecology in general and ecological networks, is that, as you're probably guessing, in an ecosystem there are many different types of interactions, and whether we can compare all of them and give a number, so I'm interacting with you at level +3 and some other at level -0.5, can be very, very hard. Whereas in some other cases that we're going to see, it's pretty straightforward, because sometimes these connections are measurable, are quantities.
Yeah, because I could see it as just, the earlier lectures we talked about mutualism and repetition, and that could just be a different color for every link. And I don't know how you would analyze that problem, but
usually, yeah, I think we will go through that, but usually the idea is that we simply we take an edge and we decide a direction, who is affecting who, and a strength at which this is happening. And there are, of course, some dynamics involved, like the density dependent between the amount of one species of one node and the amount of another. But building this network when there are many things going on is complicated for sure. We'll have the discussion in between, because it's one of the things when complex networks get closer to empirical questions, such as how do we infer, we're going to see that, is where I'm not such an expert and discussion will pop up. Okay, so that's for degree distributions, other things that we can measure. Of course, the idea of cliquishness, which is, simply put, whether my friends are friends between them, or whether species with whom I'm doing mutualism are mutualists between them. And more useful to ecology, the question is this group of friends that we have weakly connected to other groups? Are we somehow separated into even better defined groups? And for example, bipartite networks in which you have, let's say, a group of animals, a group of plants on which they pollinate, are antimodular. That is, the animals, they don't, if we look at mutualism, they are not mutualist between them, they only care about the other group, and the opposite, the plants only interact with the other groups. And these kind of things can be measured in more simple or more complex ways, but one possibility of modularity is, okay, let's look at the number of links, there's a pointer here, at the number of links within our group of friends, within our module that we have previously identified, which is the difficult part, identifying such models, and compare it to some random expectation, which is what I'm going to talk about. And the question is, if we have more links in this module compared to what we were expecting, it could be that this network is clearly separated, is well separated into modules. And of course, one question is, okay, so this is data from my network that I'm analyzing, and this is the number of links within and between nodes, so this is like the total number of links. This my network that I'm analyzing, and this here is some quantity that I'm comparing it with. And this is something that we do quite often. It says many network measures are comparisons with a null model. We observe what our network, our empirical, usually, network, and we say, does it look more something or less something than a null model? And usually this null model is a random network, a network for which we expect to have no structure. And one of the cases for random networks, one of the typical ones that is used, is the Erdős-Renyi-Gilbert version of the Erdős-Renyi graph, which is you have n nodes, and you simply admit there's a fixed probability p that two nodes are connected, and you do that for the whole network. And the thing is that the properties, again, we can discuss that later on, but the properties of these types of graphs are pretty much well known. You can measure what's the expected modularity, the expected connectance, the degree distribution of this type of graphs, and so you can say, okay, does my network look more modular in this case, in the case before, more modular than the network I am observing? And yeah, and of course there's the problem of comparing apples with oranges. That is, okay, is my network different from this random network, but maybe this random network has a different number of nodes. So, okay, we want to compare with something that has the same number of nodes and possibly the same number of links, and maybe also the same degree distribution. So how to compare between what we have and some random model that doesn't apparently have any structure is a difficult question, but it's also a very useful technique to discover if there are patterns in what we are seeing. Other things, nessedness is also very, very relevant to ecology, as we will see later on, and is a measure for how our matrices, our interaction matrices, our adjacency graphs and matrices, look like the ones on the bottom instead of the ones on the top. What does this mean? This means that, for example, if these were diets, if these were species predating or consuming other species, it would mean that you can order these species in a clear hierarchy in which the ones that are more specialist, the ones that have consume few other resources, have a diet that's nested in the ones that are more generalist, nested in the sense that it's included in the more generalist diets. And again, there are algorithms to understand whether the interaction network you have is more or less nestedness. Let's look more or less like this. We'll go later through that again. Then there's the point of motifs, another thing that we can measure in a network, which is our network built upon smaller blocks, smaller motifs, in this case, smaller patterns. For example, if we look at 3 species motifs, we look at types, for example, omnivory. So there's one species who's benefiting in some way, who's either predating 2 other species, maybe 2 trophic levels. And we can say, if we take this specific 3 species motif, do we see this in our real network? Is this motif present every now and then? And of course, once again, what we can do is the frequency of this subgraph J prime in the main graph larger or smaller than the frequency we would expect at random? So once again, we're trying to take a real network, some randomized versions of this network that somehow lose these motifs, and say, is this motif present more often? Later on, we will ask, what does this mean? We can also ask in different ways whether our network has some degree of hierarchy. And one example for this is directionality. If our network is directed, as I said, for example, on the food web, can we define a direction in which things are going? For example, in this maximal directionality, there's a clear hierarchy. Like from species 1, from node 1, you can only go to 2 or to 3 or to 4. So if you order this, the interactions will always only go into one direction. And this allows, in the end, to define a trophic level. So there's a clear hierarchy in which you can order the species. Again, there's many ways to do that. It doesn't have to be a trophic level. It can be ordering in another type of trait, but it answers the question, can we order somehow the species in this network? And different things stem from here, as you will see. So I think, yeah, these are some. There are, of course, many other things that you can measure in a network, but these are some of the things that we will be seeing. How are we so far? Am I running? Am I being, is it very obvious? Are you super familiar with all of this? No? Cool. But super unfamiliar also not, no? You're in the right point in between, which it's new, but not so new that you get everything. Relation. That's the cool part, because we have our ecological networks. Let's like measure stuff out of them, right? and learn everything. But this is where I will need help, which is a little bit already what Henry pointed, which is how do we measure these networks? And for me personally, it's very troubling because as a theoretician, I work a lot with, okay, you get this system in which you have this network, you have these interactions, you have these matrices, and you start getting things out of it. But then when you talk to ecologists, they say, yeah, but these matrices, these interactions are very hard to know, are very hard to measure, so. And what you said about comparing, for example, in the brain we all know it's an extremely complex system, but the interactions are quantifiable. You can measure the strength, but it's very hard to measure at the neuron level, but it's still a physical quantity, the interaction between 2 neurons through electric. It's in the end similar to an electric circuit or oscillation, the strength of coupling between oscillators. The same goes with gene regulation once again. You can still measure the amount of a protein. It's of course super hard, but it's likely quantifiable the amount of protein that the activation of one gene is generating in the transcription of another. But when it goes to ecology, and the people who have worked, I think we were discussing this with Sepp one day, well, how do we measure this? Because I think you were mentioning, for example, co-occurrence being something that it's, the fact that we see two species together, it might not mean anything in relation to their interactions, for example. Other things that you're familiar with in this problem. Anyway, also INTP members. It's an open question.
Can you repeat the question?
Why do you think it's hard, from what we see in the field, to infer how our network would look like? Or what methods do you use, or does people use? Because I found many different things, and I was reading for some time, but in the end it's still relatively new to me. There's also the same with presence-absence, the opposite to co-occurrence, the fact that one species is present in a site where another species is not present, and the opposite could mean, okay, they are strong competitors, they are mutually excluding each other, or not. So in the end, and this is a review that helped me quite a lot, in the end, there's many things going on. For example, I like this part here, expert knowledge, which is not something that's quantifiable. It's the fact people that are so used to be out on the field that they know that one species interacts. They know that this insect tends to go more often to that flower instead of that other one. So ecology is hard, number one, or many, because we've already seen this situation. It's very hard to infer how these networks look like. Even if it's only ones and zeros who interacts with who. It's still, if it's ones and zeros, I think it's much easier at the moment, but in case we know how our network looks like, what do we see? What are people in the field seeing? No one wants to say, Mathieu?
Yeah, I can say one thing to get
Once a
the
lot.
ball rolling, which is, I think one of the annoying things is, for instance, if you think about competition, there is no reason to have really zeros in there, right? I mean, if you're looking at a group of reasonably similar species, probably everybody is competing in a slightly non-zero way at least. And for me, it was interesting for me, I don't know if it will interest anyone else, but you know, people looking at protein structure, at some point they realized that they could really infer interactions from just correlations. If you see two bases that are very correlated among many variants of sequence, then probably it means that those are proteins that are interacting in the structure of the protein. And that doesn't work at all in ecology most of the time. And I think, for me, one of the reasons is that the places where this works well are places where interactions are very sparse, which we don't have at all, right? It works because typically one part of the protein is interacting with one or a few other, parts, but not much more than that. And then all those inference methods, they work well. But when you don't have that sparsity, it's really sad.
Just maybe as a slight counterpoint to what you said about competition, deciding what is 0 and what is 1, you can also choose an arbitrary threshold, and then you can say that below this number of interactions it's not competition, and above that it's competition. And then it's, I mean, you don't have to say like it's 0 is not competing and 1 is competing, because otherwise of course everybody is competing. But if you put
Yeah, but I'm not sure that we know how to do that and have anything meaningful as a result. Right? Like, let's say you go to grasslands and you want to say some of the grasses and plants and flowers I see here are competing and others are not. Well, is that true? I mean, everybody, the level 0 assumption might be a completely full graph of everybody competing against everybody else, like as a baseline. It's not obvious that the good baseline is sparse.
It's probably not.
It's probably not, right?
The competition is for space most of the time.
Yeah, it feels this way. Maybe it's wrong, right? But it really feels like the baseline should be more something like everybody is competing diffusely with everybody else. Which is why many of those network things, they're more about pollination or predation, where presumably, yes, there you can see that in pollination there are specialized pollinators, maybe these are more
which brings us to number one observation, which is in general ecological networks are very strongly connected. So species are either directly interacting or indirectly interacting through short paths. So and this is to say this is where not everything is lost. And what comes next is maybe you could just like not listen anymore because we're not gonna know. But observation number one, how connected, like this, what I said, this average property, links and species. What do we usually see in the field? And there's two hypotheses that kind of allow me to think in two extremes. Like for example, species have a maximum number of links, and not maximum but fixed. So this means even if the community was to be larger, the number of species of interaction that I can have is fixed. So more species, I cannot interact further with them. That's a very strong extreme, meaning I don't care if my community gets larger, that's how far I get. And somehow at the other extreme, you say species have a fixed probability P of interaction. So if more species come in the community, I will always have a certain probability of interacting with them. So my number of edges will grow as the community grows with no limit. And what we see is that in reality, the scaling looks pretty much in between these two. So it's not that its community size does not play a role, or it's also not that all species follow and they just like have more and more links. It's somewhere in between these two extremes. Next, okay, so we said, okay, this is the first kind of average out property, links and species. How are these links distributed? And if you go into the complex networks field, now it's kind of the hype is not so crazy, but around the year 2000, it was a pretty big thing. The fact that they were finding that in many different scenarios, in metabolic maps, in software graphs, I'm not sure what software is, Samuel, or you could also help.
Can you repeat the word?
Software graphs. I guess is if you take a program and you devise which parts of the program are interacting or calling to other parts of the program. In semantic nets, if you take a text and you order which word comes after or before another word, there were these findings in which many of these networks had a scale-free kind of structure. So many of the nodes are very weakly connected, but there are some very strong hubs. There's some nodes that connect to many others, and this has, as we will see, properties. And in ecology, many of these processes can be explained with these kind of rich get richer rules. So imagine a new node appears, a new word, for example, appears into a network, and if it's more probable to attach to a rich node, you will end up having these kind of structures. And in ecology, something similar has been observed, but interestingly, only up to a certain pattern. That is, imagine that the hubs are the more generalist predators. There is a point in which their diets, even if there are more and more possible prey, their diets will stop, they cannot get richer. Or if it's a resource, there's likely to be a point in which if many species are consuming that resource, competition between these species will kind of limit how many connections these resources look like. So in the straight line would refer to the degree distribution of this perfectly scale-free kind of network, and what we see is that there's a point in which the distribution is truncated and diets and the number of interactions or links starts to stop and not follow this scale-free distribution. Is it here that I'm... Yeah, so the idea, there are hubs in ecological networks, but they are not necessarily as large as in many other scale-free networks in the field of complex networks that have been measured, and so there is some properties of ecological networks that are somehow in between scale-free and small world kind of networks. This is, again, what's the implications of this kind of properties we'll see at the third part of the talk. And another issue with the degree is that it somehow informs, it highlights the presence of generalist species. So you have a network and suddenly you find that at some points in this network there are extremely connected species. So these kind of hubs, but, and this connects with next talk by Jeff again, it's not obvious whether these hubs are keystone species. Actually, they can be in some point. You have a species that extremely connected to the others, can be keystone in the sense that it changes in these species affect the rest of the community, but it doesn't necessarily have to be so. For example, in the case of the wolf in Yellowstone, I don't know if this is the complete network or more of a drawing, but it's definitely not a species that is in the middle of a network in the sense of a hub, but it's probably more a top predator that has no other edges to it. So this starts to highlight one thing, which is a network can bring in a lot of information about the processes that are going on in that system, but it might not give all the information because we will need the next lecture, which is what are the dynamics. So the degree of a node might not necessarily inform about the role of this node. Mathieu?
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to say that later, but I feel that in the notion of hub, there's often a bit of a mix of notion of, okay, high degree and notion of centrality in the graph, which doesn't count automatically as being the same. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about centrality.
Yeah.
So it's a good moment if you want to.
Yeah, exactly. Because like it could be right in the center of a graph, but having only two edges that connect two big parts of the graph, right?
Exactly.
So I think it might be a bit confusing. I mean, the term of hub is a bit confusing in the literature because people use it for potentially two different things.
Yeah.
And you could think that the keystone species is more like central than necessarily high degree.
Yeah, exactly. So here what I was talking about was in the sense of high degree. Yeah. But still it's a little bit the same. No? If you had, if you were to say, okay, it's clear that this species is central in the structure of connection, so every path has to go through this species, for example. It looks like it could inform on the role of that species, but we still lack one layer, which is the dynamics. But
and also the predators are not central.
Exactly. So when the kind of things, he said that top predators are not central typically.
Yeah.
So when the kind of things that are happening are trophic cascades, like in the Yellowstone National Park, it really could be, looks like it could be somewhere here, and this maybe be the beaver.
But anyway, the centrality metric informs about a role, not perhaps the role we imagine about a top predator, but it's important for the whole network. In the case of betweenness, for example, centrality, I think it has an important role in the network because perhaps through it connects all the system or functioning.
Yeah, we'll go through what happened. Yeah, sorry.
No, perhaps it's important to define what we are talking about when we say role and also.
Yeah. To me, and I guess it's, go on.
Yeah, just to, as a second part, what I want to say that I had forgotten, top predator would make much more sense if you model the graph as a directed graph, and then centrality loses its centrality.
The point, of course, is that I'm using this very simple, I didn't draw this, I just like using, so you have to imagine that if we go back to the original like blue and red and gray network that we had, these edges have sign and can go sign and direction, they can go through one way, through the other way, both ways around, positive, negative, so it's more complex than that and simpler metrics like, for example, trophic level as you start having things in different directions with different signs, start to be more and more difficult to infer. And of course, it's not to say that network does not inform about role. It's just to say it's likely to inform up to a certain level. And we could, I didn't put a lot of, now I'm sorry because it would have been interesting. There were other things I could have been talking about, the role, and I didn't put it because I have, in general, I tend to have this feeling in which if you don't, maybe because I come more from the dynamics instead of the structure, what I've been working on, but if you don't put the dynamics into it, you're talking too much about role is maybe not a good thing, but I don't know, we can discuss more.
No, we can't.
Oh, Samuel, you took as well.
He's gone. First we shut him.
We have computer scientists.
Yeah.
Was it?
No, sometimes it doesn't work when you use it.
And then we go to nestedness and modularity, and again, can be a good moment to stop and discuss, because these are like two very extremely well-known measures. I would say that for me, which I mean, it's a new field, if I look, okay, how do ecological networks look like, is the two things that pop up the most. Some ecological networks, mostly those in which can be defined as bipartite, that is, you have two groups that interact between them, such as host parasite or plant resource consumer, anything like, or plant pollinator. These kind of networks have been observed, I put this paper, but there are many examples, have been observed to be strongly nested. So the structure is very strongly like this. And another typical observation, also it's I think very common to food webs, but in other type of networks and with many interactions, different interactions in play, there's observations that ecological networks are very modular. So they're separated into modules that interact strongly and weakly with other modules. And we're going to talk about this later on, but just to put a point here, it appears that these two things are not unrelated, even mathematically. That is, so in the horizontal axis you have the connectance of networks. These are empirical networks. This is the connectance, or they are ordered by how connected they are. And this is the correlation between nestedness and modularity, meaning positive value is that the two metrics appear together, and a negative value is that they are negatively correlated. So the presence of one implies that the other is not, or that if a network is strongly nested, it will not be modular. But interestingly, for networks of relatively low connectance, what we see is that the two properties are strongly correlated, as in most networks that are nestedness are also modular, and the opposite way around. So it's interesting to see, and we'll see, we don't have time to go through the maths, but in some scenarios, are these two things just like independent properties? And what this, I think, scales to pretty much every property of a network, that I think it comes now, right? What it says here, it's comparing between networks, and comparing between these properties of the network can be misleading. One of the things is what I said before for random graphs. You want to compare with something that's somehow similar, it has similar properties. And it can also be misleading because what I was saying before, properties of the network are, most of them, strongly correlated with very simple things like the connectance and the distribution of degree. And for example, here, from these two papers, I think it's the other way around, but I mean the papers and the figures, but this is the variance in the degree distribution, and this is the connectance. So it's obvious that the way that the degree is, the degree distribution of the network, that thing, scale free, small world, this property, it also depends on the connectance. But also the same happens with the modularity. The more connected a network is, the more likely that modules start to appear. So before, when we are going to compare two networks, we might find, oh, this one is much more modular than this other. So it could be that there's like some meaningful ecological process that is explaining, that could explain why this network is more modular. But then you have to go one step before and say, okay, is this network more modular because it's more connected? So there's no ecological process, it's just a matter of this network being more connected than another one, or is it because the degree is distributed in some different way? So ecology is hard, or maybe it would be network theory is hard, because the properties that we have talked about, the properties that we have mentioned, they are not independent from one another. So we have to be careful when comparing. Seb?
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to talk about that later, but
The talk is finishing. I'm not going to talk about it.
Generally, abundant species have higher degrees, where it's probably the causality probably in both directions. They are more connected because they are more abundant, and the other way around as well. And in relation to what you said here, I don't know if there are any details about that, but maybe the structure of some metrics like modularity or vastness can also be related to the distribution of abundances as well. There are probably papers about that.
Yeah, I think so. So what Seb says kind of connects with me referring to Jeff the whole time. I'm putting the pressure on you because how I understand what you said is that you can have a network that gives you a structure of interactions that generate the dynamics. This species interacts with this, so its abundance can increase, decrease. And these dynamics generate a distribution of abundances. One species can be much more abundant. But this abundance, in turn, affects with how easy these species will interact. If you have one resource that is extremely common in your landscape, it's likely that it interacts with many species just because it's very common. So dynamics and structure, they are intertwined, they talk between one another. It's not a one-way process.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering how one could so you can imagine disperser, so you have different patches,
Mm-hmm.
so each patch with a network.
Mm-hmm.
So how we could capture disperser between these patches.
Okay, so this is one other type of networks in which are, I think, referring to meta communities. I look fixedly to you, it's your turn. No, so the idea is, I've been focusing and so far, and the whole talk, in my talk, the nodes are species, right? And this doesn't have to be so. But I chose and I said, okay, I have 1 hour, so I don't want to talk about too many things, but your nodes could be communities, and the edges could refer to processes of dispersal between one community to another. So this, instead of being a network of a community, could be a network of a meta-community. So, or this, in a similar fashion, this could be islands. Each node could be the species that happen on an island. So, an idea of graphs and networks of networks. So, this tool, it doesn't have to be as fixed as each node is a species. For example, in the initial exercise, each node is simply a person or a group of species. So if you do it with care, it can be applied to many scenarios. And the one you said, we'll see example later on in which we don't have each node is not a species, but actually a community.
Is it possible to have this network as species, the way it is, and then you have another kind of interaction, which then represents the disperser. So then you have different networks, and then these species are connected with another type of connection, which is then disperser or something like that.
Yeah.
Multi-layer.
These we're going to speak about also. No?
So, yeah, one comment on standardized before comparison. One way to do that is because we know that a lot of properties are related to connectance and specificness, is to build a neural model, and then you take the deviance from the neural model of each of your properties of your network, and then you compare the deviance of across your different networks instead of trying to compare them directly.
Exactly. So, which is a little bit what you say, no, either randomize if we want to compare to a random counterpart, or ensure that the two things that we are comparing, that the basal properties they have, which is like the number of links, but maybe not only the number of links, in some other instances, what I'm working on right now, you need to also have the same degree distribution. If not, you're comparing apples with oranges.
Yeah, and I would say, like, for instance, if you have this, relationship between nestedness and modularity, do you want to compare degree of modularity while fixing nestedness? Then how many properties do you need to fix?
Exactly.
Comparison fair. And if you fix everything, then you just have a single network.
Exactly. Exactly.
So there's no well-defined.
Yeah.
Depends on your question. So I think there are ways to try to go in that direction.
Jeff?
Yeah, I had a comment about the question that was asked about dispersal, and also Seb saying that it had something also to do with the relationship between degree and abundance, that if you see the network as representing interactions of species that are across space, then typically the reason why abundant species have many interactions is also in part because they're in places they encounter many other interacting partners. So there you see how all those things are kind of part of the same notion, because through space you have things that are in many places via dispersal, and maybe they are in many places because they can interact with many things. So the causality is a bit intertwined, of course, but we were in some of the analysis that Moya had done, you see that effect very clearly, the spatial coherence and number of links are
Yeah. So Nuria Galeana was a member here of the INTP, and she's worked quite a lot. And actually, last year she talked about area complexity relations in the end, no, and number of links compared to, so like trying to relate properties of a network with spatial properties of the system distribution in space, and finding that there are, of course, strong correlations, as you said. And for what you said, yes, there is a field of research that studies what happens when we have our networks connected by dispersal. And in ecology, and also, for example, in machine learning, I don't know, or artificial intelligence is starting to see what happens if our neural network, instead of having nodes at each that we control the weights, it actually has, in the end, neural networks at each of the nodes. So it's common among different things, like this idea of networks of networks.
Maybe another question. So I was just wondering, so how are these networks always analyzed? So is it sufficient to just like get this topology, the connections, and then you calculate the matrix? Or is it that you then have to run simulations and then maybe incorporate differential equations some way, and then run simulations over time again?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's what Jeff said, that these two things are intertwined. So topology affects the dynamics, these differential equations. The dynamics affect, in the end, the topology. My view, also because I said I'm more used to work with dynamics, is that the network alone is unlikely to inform about what's going to happen. But it's much more tractable. For those systems, those very big empirical networks that I said, if you have to play dynamics there, it might be hard to understand what could happen. Whereas the network, see that I've just set many properties in a short amount of time. So, and that's the next. Okay, it's okay if we go on, because we're going to see about this now. So it's a little bit what you connect. Why this structure? What's the causality? And So, of course, the point is, we've seen slightly, but these are not metrics, that ecological networks are not random. And the question is why? And more than why, is this departure from randomness informing us about something? And moreover, can we use this? Okay, we see this pattern, we see this structure in the network, we know that this is happening for something. And this is a little bit what I'm going to talk now, before we end. And so one example of the process one way around, in which the structure simply emerges as a byproduct of the way that the network is built. For example, the What's Strongest model, this was at the beginning of the revolution of the complex networks field. They realized that if you take a regular lattice, where everyone interacts, for example, with the first neighbor and the second neighbor, and you add a small probability of every now and then taking, for example, this interaction here and rewiring it, only with this very simple probabilistic algorithm. Okay, I take some of the wires and I bring them to another place in the network, you suddenly started to have a very strong small world property. So suddenly your network became a little bit like the social network, so network of social interactions we mentioned. And in ecology, there are other examples. There are similar examples of, for example, the niche model, the cascade model, that belong to the same, trying to understand the properties of food webs. If we order our predators in a line, and we decide that they predate on a range of other species distributed in this line, depending on specific properties, we'll find that these networks of who predates who interacts with who, recovers some relevant distributions that are observed in the field. So this is to say, it could be that the patterns, the structures of this network, they are simply there because of the ways, the rules that are in which species decide to interact. For example, this axis here could be body size. And so structure is really not, topology is just a byproduct, for example, as Seb said, a byproduct of the abundance. But the thing could also be the other way around. For example, if you take empirical food webs that have scale-free structures, and also I think this is in these specific drawings not empirical, but you realize that if you perform random extinction, that is, you take random nodes out of it, the network would be much more resilient than expected, and thanks to the fact that many of the nodes, they are not strongly connected. Resilient here, once again, we don't have the dynamics, so we are looking here at the white spots, which are the size of the size of the biggest component of the network, the biggest number of nodes that are all somehow connected. And what we realize is that if we take a species at random, the size of this component decays very slowly. Whereas if we are able to find which are the hubs and make them go extinct, there's a transition and the big component at some point just breaks down. Here there's no dynamics, it's a very simple example, but what we realize is, okay, the network, the structure just comes as a byproduct, or maybe the structure plays a role in the dynamics, plays a key role in the functioning of this ecosystem. And so what does a structure, is a structure meaningful? Meaningful is a very, not very useful word here, but two possible claims in favor of structure being meaningful. I don't know if you're familiar with this extremely famous paper from Robert May. I guess it also connects more with Jeff's talk because there's dynamic involved here. But very, very briefly, what May realized is that if you have a very large ecosystem and you don't know a lot of information of this community, let's suppose that things are so intertwined that you can assume that this community interacts randomly in a random network. This interacts with this other, and positively, negatively, it's hard to say. So in this very abstract version of a community, or maybe not so abstract, maybe I'm quite good at depicting the community. And yeah, this comes from physics, from the idea of the models of the nucleus of these very, very heavy atomic particles. Okay, if I have this very large community of random interactions, what may realize is that at some point, if the heterogeneity of these interactions, or the size of this community, or the connectivity of this community increases, there will be a point in which the system will become unstable. So, kind of saying it in other words, what he realized is that mathematically, it appears that if interactions follow a random network, we shouldn't really see very big ecosystems, because they shouldn't be stable. Exactly. Thank you. So one possibility for structure is, why do we see complex communities if random complex networks are not stable? Because their ecological structure, structure of interactions is not random. This would be one way to get out of this very relevant paradox. And one other claim for structure is that in many other fields in biology it works. It works quite amazingly. For example, this is some specific motifs in the process of DNA damage repair, and that's, for example, very relevant to cancer. And also in neural networks, interactions between proteins, there are very well-defined motifs that appear in these networks, and the repetition of these motifs is known to play a role, a specific role. So the fact that you have enough of some feed-forward loops or some negative feedback loops, having enough of this, or the structure where how these motifs are ordered, it plays a relevant role that is well known. But in ecology, as we said, things are not so simple, and it's sometimes really hard to tell whether structure and function are really related. For example, one example that I find interesting is that of nestedness. So we know that bipartite networks, for example, plant pollinator, have been observed to be strongly nested. And what they started to realize, and this is another famous, well-known article, what they realized is that mutualism, and this is not what they realized, but it was already in place. Suppose these two plants, it's easier to understand the animals, but or whatever, these two plants compete for space, for resources, but they are all pollinated by the same species. So the fact that they are mutualistic to the same species, to the same pollinator, in the end reduces their effective competition, because they benefit one other species that helps them. And what they realized is that if the structure is nested, as observed in the field, this effect of effectively reducing competition thanks to mutualism is much more exacerbated. And what we see is that as the matrix becomes nested, the amount of species that can survive in this system, thanks to this apparent indirect mutualism, is much higher. So it's a pretty impressive result, because, okay, so nested structures can really help biodiversity, so they play a big role. It's really as if, and this also relates to Seb's talk on Monday, as if there was somehow of community level selection. This community is being somehow able to increase its biodiversity, so structure could be an adaptation for biodiversity. And interestingly, on the other hand, for example, other people claim that nested is a byproduct. It's not something that really is there because it's playing an important role in biodiversity or stability.
Just on the previous slide, Do you want to explain this equation, or you don't have time?
No. Some people laugh. No, we can look through it. I don't find it trivial. I was looking into it, and then I realized it's I don't wanna get. It's a little bit the idea on the talk that there are so many things that it's easier to explain in simple words. But if you want to find, for example, the algorithms to find modules or clusters, it becomes. So maybe the idea is okay. I present a bunch of ideas that are being studied, and then the details we can look at them together. I would be happy. So they realized the fact that nestedness increases biodiversity. The mathematics behind are not. I don't think they are simple. But what other people is saying is okay, but they realized in this reference here, suppose you have a network of animals and plants, and you just do two simple processes in which you imagine that this network somehow evolved, appeared in the, or assembled in this case. So first, which is step one, there's a speciation event. So for example, you have a new A4, a new animal that stems from A3 and copies its interactions. And then at another level, there's some sort of divergence, some sort of mutation in this network. For example, one node, one edge disappears, so this animal does not have anymore anyone to pollinate, or in this case, a new edge appears. So you just add a new species, copy the interactions that it has from its original species, from where it is speciated, and you allow for some mutation in the random mutation in the edges. And what they found is that this very simple assembly process, this very simple evolutionary process, generates nested structures as well as many other properties. So once again, is nestedness
selective or approach?
Is nestedness something that is very useful for the network and that it's there because it's benefiting the functioning of the network, or is nestedness a byproduct of some simple underlying assembly rules? And this relates also to the idea of spandrels, which I find, they choose this example, which I don't think it's the easiest one to understand, but they were a bit, this paper is also very famous. It's a critique to the idea that everything is an adaptation, or be careful when the fact that something appears to have a function might not necessarily mean it's an adaptation. And the spandrels of San Marco and the Basilica of San Marco in Venice, the spandrels refer to this triangle. And what they say is, even if these triangles appear very beautifully decorated, we have to be careful when thinking, oh, they are put there because of some function, because these triangles, they only emerge there because they have to be in between the arcs and the dome, so it's like a structural byproduct. They are simply there because of the structure needed to hold the roof. And one other way, like another more stupid example, is that okay, so the nose is very good at holding my glasses, so it's adapted to hold my glasses because it does that. It's a bit aggressive of an example, but just to say that this debate between spandrel and adaptation is non-trivial. One other problem with yeah, sorry.
Concerning that point,
Yeah, you were.
nestedness can be a byproduct and nevertheless have a function of...
I believe that both models are relevant. I don't think that they are. It's not in the models. It's in the interpretation of the results. As in, yeah, like.
If we use the same terminology as I suggested the other day, in that case, in the case of byproduct, nestedness is a service function, and in the case of evolved nestedness, then it's a design function.
exactly.
But in both cases, the nestedness function as a stabilizing factor.
Yeah, yeah. Jeff?
To be, I'm not sure I understood the point, but I guess I'll tell you what I understood and you tell me if I'm wrong. So the model of the Valverde, yeah. So they put some process that has nothing to do with diversity or it's just doing its thing and the network structure doesn't influence it. And yet you have an emergence of nestedness, and you also have a relationship between diversity and nestedness here.
You mean here?
Yeah, if I remember this paper, the criticism of giving,
this other one, yeah.
of giving nestedness a role, even like the service function, or even more than science.
Yeah, because from what I understand, here they don't imply dynamics. They don't. There's no positive of like species. I think the only rule they have if a pollinator is not connected to any plant, it will get extinct.
That's dynamics.
Yeah, it's one minimal rule, but there's no intermediate competition between plants that is affected with the number of I think the only rule that stems from here is that the more connected that you are, the less probable that you will become extinct. And I'm not at the point to like discuss whether one or the other model is more.
I'm just wondering what point.
What point I'm making here or they are making here?
Yeah, what point they.
To me, it's the fact that many properties of a network can emerge by relatively simple assembly rules. And for example, the small world kind of example, you just like take some wires and rewire them. The fact that this can happen, at least for me, should make you cautious when attributing a design function explanation to nestedness. So it might be true that nestedness fosters biodiversity. I don't know, but be careful when thinking we see nestedness because there has been an adaptation processes for which communities that are more nestedness and hence allow more biodiversity have been selected for. Maybe we just see nestedness there because of the way communities have assembled. And I'm not to make a strong claim or one or the other, and I cannot like full on explain the process here. But even there, to me, it brings up the question, which is really what Seb's talk was about Monday. Are things, I didn't remember the word, I'm sorry, but service or design. I think just they emerge and they are useful, or they are useful and hence they are selected for. And
we can even imagine that they emerge as a byproduct, they are useful, and then selection reinforces the...
Yeah, and it's very hard to know. It's still similar, but the causation process is, I guess, hard to infer here.
But I think that it also would be, in terms of bioproducts, thinking in ecological terms, that if you are an abundant species, or no, on the other side, if you are a rare species, only a generalist species can interact with you, because otherwise you will be extinct if the two rare species interact. Interactions
between them. Yeah.
Between them, of course. It's not stable in the time, so at the end, unless the structure is what will be selected, it's not or only possible.
Yeah, I guess it's similar to what they're funding. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think your argument is kind of implicit in their process. I think so.
Yeah.
Again, one more thing, like
Yeah.
in the slide before, like the rationale that nestedness decreases competition between plants by having this indirect mutualism through the pollination. Couldn't you see this as competition for pollination resources as well? And then it's not so clear to me that the net effect is positive between plants.
Competition for pollination resources.
Yeah.
I don't know if I follow. I mean, the example, if the dark lines were the other way around, you have two pollinators that compete, but they both pollinate the same plant. So my enemy is somehow making my resource grow better. So our competition is somehow being reduced because I don't know if that was your question.
Yeah, I guess it's not so clear to me if I'm a plant and I'm taking away the pollinators of the other plant because they're all going to pollinate this plant.
Yeah, so it really depends whether the pollination, the number of pollinators is fixed by something else, and then you're right, or it could increase and then this is right.
Yeah. Or is there some functional response that then differentially?
Yeah.
It's a little bit comes together with the zero-sum game. So like if the number of pollination is fixed, then there's competition for and then the flowers get very beautiful and shiny because they want to be attractive. But
Like to me, both look reasonably possible. Like intuitively, they both make sense, but I'm not sure what's actually possible in nature.
I don't know more, less than you. I don't know. Okay, so we're almost there. A little bit the same with modularity. Modularity being the very commonly observed pattern. And there's evidence, for example, and this connects a little bit with you, Stephen, that if you have a network, in this case, of a meta community of dispersal that is organized in a modular way, this network will help the system resist perturbations better. That is, because the network is modular, a perturbation in this module might be constrained inside this module and not propagate. So in terms of perturbations, modularity helps the functioning of the network. But even the ones that found this paper, even they say in the absence of perturbations, modularity it is kind of a buffer, not helping diversity, and it's also people that approach the same process with mathematics and the idea of random matrices and so on. They also find that whether modularity is stabilizing or destabilizing, it can depend on many properties like connectivity of the network. At low connectivities, modularity might be stabilizing, but at high connectivity is the opposite, or also the sign whether interactions are more positive or more negative. So, to me, from what I understand, modularity is still kind of an open question, because it constrains perturbations to the module, but it's really unclear how it helps the community be more stable. So maybe it's also could be a byproduct. And yeah, just this, if I had the time, I would leave like 3 more slides, but can be open to discuss. I mentioned, because Jinju asked about my research yesterday, and I'm studying how networks and the fact that they are more or less trophically ordered, can this allow the presence of loops? So in a network in which everything goes up, in a very stupid way of saying it, it's very hard to find these loops, these feedback loops. Whereas in a network in which interactions can go in different ways because the network is not so well ordered, you can have positive feedback loops, negative feedback loops. How does this affect the dynamics? It's one possible question in the structure dynamics kind of questions. Other things that came up, for example, several of you mentioned multi-layer networks, not something that I've worked with, but could it be a new way of mentioning, for example, your Henry, in the beginning you said, what if interactions refer to different things? And it's what he said, what if you have positive and negative interactions as the one we've been talking about, and dispersal. Could you put them together in the same network, or maybe it's better to have a new tool, a new mathematical tool that allows you to have networks and dispersal between them, or also temporal evolution. And one of the things that is also very trendy, I would say, at the moment, is what if interactions are not only pairwise? We've been talking about graphs, so two species interact, two nodes interact, but for example, it could be in epidemiology, you could have that the likelihood of one species being infected by a virus depends on whether this species is or is not infected by another virus. So the strength of an interaction depends on the presence of a third. So suddenly, here in yellow you have 4 species. Suddenly, the strength of an interaction depends on 4 species. And to me, from what I understand, it's still, first it's still an open question how to model this, because there are different tools that bring different kind of results, and whether this brings really new understanding of the processes that are happening. In other fields it appears so, for example in synchronization, but in ecology I think it's a very early question, and I will pass this to Jeff to answer it. You love higher order interactions, no? No. And yeah, so for conclusions, I think we kind of went through the tools of complex networks. They do help understand, get a first impression of how communities are organized, and in some cases we get these recurring patterns that are relatively simple. So you can have hundreds of species, but you measure something and it always relatively looks the same, for example in the case of nestedness or modularity. But what this pattern means is of course not clear. It can be a byproduct of simple rules, it can deeply affect the functioning of the community, it can be both, and so from what I understand there are many questions, open questions, to disentangle this pattern to process maps, and in ecology even more. And that's all. 1 minute extra. Do we do questions or?
Yes, if we have time for a few, and then coffee break. Yeah, I wanted to make a small comment related to dispersal and on that, which is that you mentioned it, but I think it's really worth emphasizing for me. The main conclusion of going to many complex network conferences is which properties of the network are important. It really depends on the dynamics that you put on, or the question that you ask, or something like this. And maybe the only place where people have converged on something like an answer is really networks of motion in space. Like if the dynamics that you put is just things moving around, then roughly more or less we know what are the important properties. But for any kind of other network, honestly, it's really open. I mean, it's not at all obvious, which is also why we have very different answers for what matters.
Yeah. I mean, I think if, for example, Luis, who works on complex networks a lot and works on synchronization processes, if he looks at this stuff, he's like, nestedness, like, who cares about nested? So yeah, it depends, it strongly depends, it's not. That was the idea of trying to give this overview, because it's like, there are so many things you can measure, you can get, and shortest path, for example.
I have a question. It seems like a lot of the networks are like having nodes operate at the species level, like rabbit, foxes, or whatever. I mean, is there any interest in like stepping down a level and just like, instead of having just fox as one node, but you have all the foxes in an area?
Yeah.
Does that give you a different perspective, or is it just wasted computation?
No. I think it's relevant to ask other types of questions. I have one review that starts there. I have to say I'm not super used at what happens when each node is an individual, but I know of one article that starts, like, looks at these different levels of different scales and say, okay, networks of individuals, networks of species and up to networks of patches, of spatial, of islands, for example. I don't think that the jump from each scale, from population to individuals, is just a stupid coarse grading. Like, okay, I think each scale has relevant information of its own.
Because I think along those lines, if you were to construct a network at the individual level, let's say you're doing like the block of Volterra with links and hairs, can your analysis of the network show the cyclical nature, or how could those properties pop out, or is it not possible? You would only get this kind of snapshot.
That's the main question. In the specific case you say, I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think so that you can have cycling just because of the structure of the networks if you don't impose some specific dynamics. I don't know. But this is the question. Like, can I think in some instances the structure of the network can inform of what's going on, and in some instances, if you then take into account the specific dynamics, you're not able to explain what's going on. And the other way happens, and we know that sometimes mean field differential equations, like two species, this interacts, and you admit that they just interact on average. Also there you can lose information and not be able to exactly. Sometimes you need space, sometimes you need structure, and knowing at each level what ingredients are necessary to kind of explain the pattern, or try to explain the pattern, is the relevant exercise, I think, one of the relevant exercises.
Maybe related to that, and if we try to connect with what we have seen yesterday, you can use like weighted links networks, where you could weigh the links by the strength of interactions, and then if we have an idea of self-regulation, we could have a map of the ratio interaction strength over self-regulation, and we could try to calculate the lambda values in between the two links. I don't know if this is done, but that could be a way to try to detect where you have strong interactions and likelihood or cascades. That could be maybe something that I'm not sure if this would work at the scale of the network, but this connects to what we have seen.
Yeah, so I kind of like the example you gave where they linked nestedness to biodiversity. To biodiversity or something like that.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm just wondering if maybe it's possible that these metrics might mean different things for different types of food webs or something like that.
Of interactions?
No, these metrics, method metrics, might mean different things for different food webs. Or if they are doing some kind of an attempt to generalize and form this linkage, what these metrics mean in terms of ecology.
Yeah, I think in ecology, I'm maybe not positioned to answer, but I think it's one of the big questions in complex systems is, okay, you have, as I said, like semantic webs, the internet, gene regulation, or in ecology, food webs, pollination, different number of species, and the fact we observe these networks, and we observe some things that are pretty much universal. It's a very strong word, but are very common. Very, very common. Like, for example, all these very different networks, they have the same degree distribution. And one of the key questions for me in complex systems is this universality meaning anything? Is the underlying process the same? Or maybe the fact that maybe it's a crazy thing to compare food webs with plant like to look at things that are so different. Maybe it's to me it's not, but I think it's a personal, not belief, but.
On that point, yeah, I think there's a bit of it's a bit like, if you look at the distribution somewhere and you see that it is kind of like a normal distribution, it tells you nothing basically. It tells you because that's the easiest thing that you could get by many different processes, right? So it's helpful to know which are those things that are very easy to have, because it also tells you which ones will not tell you much about the underlying process, right?
Yeah, it's also like, yeah, as you said, the idea of comparing with the random expectation, and the fact that when you compare to the random expectation, things are not random in ecology and in many other complex systems, and well, the whole thing, like ecological networks, we see that they don't appear as random networks. But what does this mean is, I think some of the questions have to be community specific, like specific to systems. Okay.
Maybe just a comment, like something that has been bugging me about, network analysis on more like plant-animal interaction networks, for example, pollination and mutualism, is about how the networks are constructed. Like, I know a lot of these are based on present-Jackson, like observations of the interactions, and then sometimes it can be weighted based on how many times the interaction has been observed. So that's one way of looking at it. But as you mentioned earlier, it's a bit frequency driven. But then there's the other type, which is looking at trait matching maybe to infer like the strength of the interaction. But to me, I don't know how correlated that is with the actual effectiveness of the interaction, like how effective this is as a dispersal. For example, it could be very dependent on stuff that we are not measuring. Like for example, the animal's behavior. Some animals, like they eat the fruit, but then they just take a bite and then they throw it. They don't disperse it far. So that's not an effective dispersal. And then, so I'm just wondering, and kind of that's the thing that worries me about this kind of analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's what I wanted to kind of mention here, and I had a similar thing, but coming from the other way, like coming from theory and going like, yeah, we have all these tools to measure all this stuff and infer all these properties of the matrix of the network, but realizing that obtaining the network is very hard. For example, yeah, you have a network, and then there's one component that is very relevant and also a little bit connected, which is all these things are, for what I've been talking, appear pretty static, but they are not. Like interactions can change in time, can be different. For example, the presence of a different predator might change the diet of a specific prey, or might change. So it could be there are many lines of research to try to improve the tools of complex networks. One is this multi-layer. What if things can change in time? What if interactions cannot be pairwise? But yeah, inferring networks is a complex thing, and I think for what you just said, you're more familiar with this difficulty than I am. Yeah. Which I think puts a big, not barrier, but a big gap, because theory is really based on us knowing how these matrices look like, and some relevant things can be said if we have the matrices, but having these matrices is a very big empirical difficulty. Okay, coffee break?
Coffee break.